Manager of System Design and Transformation at the Australian Energy Market Operator. So over to Alex, if you're able to move to the next slide, please. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, albeit virtually. I'm coming to you from the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation's lands, and I would like to pay respects to their elders past and present. So today's format, we're going to be walking through some of the key highlights of the WA GSOO report. Following the presentation, we'll open up for questions and answers at the end to try and help it flow smoothly. If you can please raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. If you'd like to speak, then please come off mute, state your name and organisation before starting with your question or comment. You're also welcome to add questions in the chat. We'll be recording the presentation today with a view to publishing it on our website. If you've got any feedback whatsoever, please do send it through to the WA Future System Design email address, which is at the bottom of the slide there. As I mentioned, today we're going to be walking through the key findings. I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce Alex Uchansky, Manager of WA Future System Planning and Forecasting. Alex has only been with AEMO a month, but has absolutely hit the ground running in his new role, and he'll be taking you through the findings today. And then Greg Sims, a senior analyst in our team, will be helping facilitate the question and answer session. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Alex to take you through today's presentation.
Sorry, Alex, I think you're on mute.
If you twist the cord, that might help, or alternatively, you might need to move to another place and take your headphones out, unfortunately, Alex.
Just change my microphone settings, so I'm hopeful that's working out. Great. Okay, just a quick introduction for those who may be new to the GSOO. It's a 10-year outlook. In this edition, we're working towards a 20-year outlook, but in this case, the period from 2025 to 2034. We've got 3 scenarios running through the report: the progressive change, the step change, and the green energy exports. For the purpose of this session, and consistent with the previous gas consultative forums that we've run, we will just be focusing mainly on the step change scenario, but the report itself has all the content associated with all 3. A little bit about the step change scenario is just listed there in those dot points. It's been aligned with the WEM ESOO that was released earlier on in this year, and that's underpinned by AEMO's assumptions under the IASR. The copy of the GSOO report itself was published yesterday, so that's available on AEMO's website. Also, just wanted to highlight today is a presentation of results, and it comes after a long and lengthy and quite a critical process in terms of stakeholder engagement. So that process kicked off in July of this year through the formal information requests. We had GCFs, or gas consultative forums, in each of October and November. And that has largely contributed in a great deal to getting to where we are today. Also, just calling out a few of the recommendations that have come out of the domestic gas inquiry. So this GSOO report takes into account a number of those. For example, the updated policy around onshore projects supplying 80% to the domestic market until 2030 has been factored in, and 100% after 2030. In terms of forecast decarbonisation pathways, again, there's been the alignment with the decarbonisation scenarios presented under the ESOO. And emissions targets this time have been applied to the GPG modelling. I mentioned earlier around the extension of the outlook period to 20 years. So that's absolutely something that we're working towards. Just with the time and information constraints meant that we weren't able to include that for this year's GSOO, but we've already started looking at that and how we're going to adapt that for the next round. So I am going to now just step through the main body of the slides. Again, the GSOO report itself was released yesterday, so I'll start with some of the key messages that are coming out of the GSOO this year round, and then I'll explore some of the key drivers of consumption, demand, supply in a little more detail. By the end of this presentation, I'll hand over to Greg, who will help us facilitate any questions we might have at the end. Okay, so in terms of the key findings that we're seeing from this year's report, the key message there really is that supply adequacy has improved in the near term. So in the first few years of the forecast. In the longer term, and in particular in the 2030s, we do still see those continued risks of annual supply gaps emerging. So as I mentioned, in the first three years of the forecast, supply is forecast to exceed consumption. And that is an improved outlook on last year's forecast, which saw, if you recall, year-on-year supply gaps in the near term. So supporting this improvement in the near term is an increase in supply, alongside a temporary reduction in mining and industrial gas use. So then as we go beyond the first 3 years of the forecast, we see risks of a potential supply gap emerging in 2028. And that's particularly the case if supply projects are unable to be accelerated or if there is a step change in consumption in that year. From 2030, on the consumption side, domestic gas consumption remains relatively flat, while the reserves in existing gas fields declines. That means that new supply projects will be required in order to support that continued level of consumption. We'll also, to that last bullet point, we'll also talk a little bit about gas-powered electricity generation, or what we call GPG, in this GSOO, and that represents approximately 20% of the market. But it's interesting to call out because it is one of those ones that is forecast to become peakier and more seasonal. So the key message there is that as a proportion of the total Swiss supply mix, GPG declines over the outlook period, but importantly, peak gas usage is forecast to increase, and that reaffirms the role that gas plays in supporting WA's electricity system. So I'm going to move to a slide on the consumption side. And at the very highest level, it's a tale of two halves, if you like. So in comparison to last year's GSOO, which is the broken green coloured line there, and this year's GSOO being the solid line, we do see a softening of demand in the near term, and that's primarily driven by the curtailment or suspension of operations across the nickel, alumina, and lithium industries. From the late 2020s, though, we see not only a return of those impacted operations or projects, but baseline production growth compared to last year's forecast, combined with programs of fuel switching coal to gas, that's driving a higher forecast in comparison to last year. So staying on the consumption side, this slide examines the consumption forecast a little bit more closely. And as I said, the first few years of that forecast are the lowest over the 10-year outlook. And again, that's driven by the curtailment or the suspension of alumina, nickel, and lithium operations. You'll notice from 2028 there is a step up in consumption, and that's driven by a few things. So, firstly, it's driven by a restart of those previously curtailed operations. It's also driven by expansions or increased volume growth at existing operations. And thirdly, it's driven by the commencement of new projects, notably Perdaman's Karratha Urea project, which is forecast to commence in 2027 and is forecast to be at full gas consumption by 2028. And then as you go into the period from 2032 onwards, there is a slight easing in demand due to electrification assumptions and slightly lower GPG gas consumptions as more renewables enter the system. Which is probably a good segue into my next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit more about gas-powered electricity generation in a bit more detail. So the generation from GPG is shown in the blue shaded area towards the bottom left of the chart. You'll notice that it remains relatively flat over the outlook period, at least under this view. Gas consumption by GPG does in fact ebb and flow a little bit. So it tends to increase in the year or two immediately following coal retirements, but eases back off from 2032 as more renewables enter the system. So overall gas consumption by GPG is forecast to be approximately 190 TJs a day by 2034, which is actually very similar levels to which it is today. So gas consumption by GPG remains broadly the same, but as a proportion of the generation supply mix, due to the model build out of renewables, and in particular you can see their wind generation, GPG ultimately provides a smaller percentage of the total megawatt hours. What becomes really important though is when those megawatt hours are provided, which is the box and whisker plot on the right hand side. So the modelling there shows that annual peak demand from GPG increasing from just short of 300 TJs a day in 2025 to more than 500 TJs a day by 2033. Furthermore, you'll notice a clear trend towards consumption in the winter season. And this is something that's consistent or was observed under the forecasts of the 2024 WEM ESOO, with which forecast increasing peak demand events during winter, driven by electrification of heating loads and the comparatively lower impact of DPV or distributed PV generation to meeting evening peak demand during winter as the sun sets earlier than summer. So that's a fair bit of information, but it's probably a long way of saying more renewables in the system means more variability on gas demand, and in particular over winter, where there is both increased residential electrification demand on the grid and lower output from renewables. So I'm just going to pivot a bit to the supply side of the forecast. And as you can see from this chart, the supply side, the supply forecast includes a bit of a mix of existing projects in purple, committed projects in green, and probable projects in yellow. So in the short term to 2025, again, we see that increased supply from some of the major production facilities, including Gorgon, Wheatstone, North West Shelf, and under the Pluto acceleration commitment. Supply then eases off a little bit in 2026 with both the end of the Pluto agreement and lower forecast quantities from the North West Shelf. In the final quarter of 2026, Scarborough is forecast to commence and gradually ramping up to reach approximately 180 TJs a day. And then again in early 2027, we have the potential supply from the West Erregulla commencing again with a ramp-up profile reaching ultimately sort of just shy of 80 TJs a day. Fast forwarding to 2029, Waitsia Stage 2's domestic gas obligation kicks in and supplies approximately 200 TJs a day, along with the potential supply from the Lockheed Gas project, which is also forecast to commence in 2029, reaching 80 TJs a day. And so then you've got the period in the 2030s where the potential supply forecast declines as natural reserves deplete at existing gas fields. There are other, it's worth pointing out as well, other what we term proposed projects in the market that are not included here in AEMO's supply forecast because they are outside of AEMO's modelling criteria for what is considered a probable project. But having said that, AEMO continues to monitor the market for signposts of development of projects that are outside the modelling criteria, but very much remain on AEMO's watch list for inclusion in future WA GSOOs. This next slide is a really interesting one, and I wanted to include it for the purposes of this presentation, and there's a view on this in the GSOO report itself. So we have a historical chart to the left and a forecast chart to the right. What you're looking at here is daily demand from Swiss GPG in the light blue and daily demand from the rest of the domestic gas market in the dark blue. Overlaid in the dark purple line plot is annual supply. And then in the broken pink line above that is annual supply inclusive of storage capacity. From a historical perspective, you can see that, yes, there's been periods of certainly outages and disruption and periods where storage has had to be utilised. But by and large, there's been relative stability, at least from this bird's eye view, from a historical perspective. In comparison to the right-hand side chart, where, again, under the first 3 years of the forecast, it's an improved position on the same time last year in terms of that forecast. And yes, we continue to see tightness in the market, and things like unplanned production outages can certainly add to supply risk. But again, by and large, at least in terms of those first few years of the forecast, the infrastructure is there. As we move into 2028, you will notice that the dark blue domestic daily demand stepping up in that year and faster than some of the new supply sources which come online a year later in 2029. And then as the forecast enters the 2030s, you will notice more volatility from GPG gas demand in the light blue growing across those years. And again, in particular over those winter months. And that exceeds the combined annual capacity of forecast supply and storage. So this analysis indicates a couple of things to me. So the first thing is that the primary constraint here is the molecules of the gas itself. And in order to meet a given higher baseline level of gas consumption in the future, more domestic gas supply is going to be needed. But secondly, not only is more gas supply needed to meet that given level of demand, but flexible supply is needed, given that increased volatility of GPG demand, which you see running through this chart. And so this is probably my final slide, but I wanted to sort of bring it all together in this final slide. You would have seen this chart, the supply adequacy chart, if you've managed to have the opportunity to read through the GSOO materials. So again, just to recap, there's 3 time horizons here. So in the near term, the position is improved on last year, and so in this year's forecast, the solid purple line there is above that solid teal line from 2025 to 2027. We've got gas supply forecast to exceed gas consumption by around about 78 petajoules across those 3 years. This is supported again by those increased near-term flows from some of those major gas production facilities, but also by the decreased consumption from suspension of nickel and alumina operations. Also in this first few years, supply is forecast to start growing with the assumed commencement of the Scarborough project in late 2026 and also West Erregulla in early 2027. You've then got the period in the middle of the outlook period, starting from 2028. And I suppose that's characterised by a little bit of increased uncertainty during, what I would call a key period in the energy transition as we approach 2030. And we do call out a risk of a supply gap emerging there in that year of 2028. And that's at least until those extra supply side projects can catch up in the following year. So again, we have consumption stepping up in 2028. Notably, again, we have Perdaman's Karratha Urea project having ramped up to full gas consumption by 2028. And that project is, as has been announced, is contracted to take approximately 130 TJs a day from Woodside. But also in that year, we forecast the reactivation of alumina and nickel processing plants around about that time, as well as baseload growth from existing operations across mining and mineral processing industries. And finally, you've got the period from 2030 onwards, which is characterised by growing annual supply gaps. So they grow up to 191 TJs a day by the end of the outlook period. Consumption remains more or less flat over this period, but supply declines driven by declining production from existing gas fields with natural reserve depletion. Also over this period, we talked about how gas power generation plays an increasingly seasonal and peaky role. Okay, so that wraps up the main summary of key findings from the presentation. It was a pleasure presenting to you all at this forum. I'm now going to hand over to Greg Sims, who will facilitate the Q&A session. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks for the presentation and the messages that you've given there. So currently we don't have any questions in the chat, but we'd like to open up the forum for questions. So if you don't mind raising a hand, I think we see one there from Stefan Mero. If you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking your question, please.
Thanks, Greg. I just have a question around the assumptions on EPA approvals and supply constraints in relation to expansions and new projects. What are the assumptions there?
So I think, I may be able to assist with that one. So for the probable projects that we're seeing, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of feedback here. Alex, would you mind? Okay, thank you. So for the probable projects that we're seeing, we monitor the EPA website as to the status of environmental approvals progress. So what we see and what we need to see in order to include a project as a probable project is that there is progress towards an FID, and that obviously includes the approvals. And so for the West Erregulla and Lockyer projects, we have seen that there has been steps forward in the approvals. And yeah, as I said, they're at various stages of approvals. So for those ones those are captured. We're monitoring the likes of Browse very closely. You would have seen some recent media in relation to the Northwest Shelf and the Browse project. And that is potentially a contender for inclusion in next year's GSOO, depending on how far the approvals go for that project. I think, if there's anything else that anyone else on the team would like to add to that.
Thanks for that, Greg. That was pretty comprehensive in relation to the EPA approvals. What about things like labour and materials bottlenecks?
Yeah, right. So we make some fairly generic assumptions around the progress of projects and assumptions around the speed at which projects can be executed. And they're generic but benchmarked to historical projects. So, for example, you'd have a Wheatstone timeline or a Pluto timeline for its execution. Pluto, for example, is a 7-year between discovery and first LNG. And so we'd use those as benchmarks in relation to future projects. And so that's as far as it goes. We can potentially include furthers. I believe there's someone else is sharing some comments.
Thanks, Greg.
all you have to do is say exactly what he did, like from the first.
Sorry, yeah, I got interrupted there by someone else who was on the chat. Yeah, if there's anything else you'd like me to cover, happy to do that. Please do ask your questions.
I've got one question, if I may. Dominic Rodwell here from CITIC. There's in the supply demand side thing, looking at that, there's an oversupply for a few years and then there's an undersupply. How does the modelling cater for the oversupply having not been consumed in those previous years, then being available to be consumed in the latter years, and therefore there is no undersupply?
Excellent question. Thank you for that one. So it's assumed not to be displaced, or in other words, time displaced from one period to the next. So it's potential that's available when it comes to an undersupply issue. It's assumed that decline has actually taken place relative to the oversupply in a given year. So it is possible that to cover the supply gap in 2028, there may be further reserves that are available to support that, but the forecast is relatively conservative in relation to upstream deliverability. What else? Yeah, is there anything else that you'd like to add to that? Anybody on the team? Alex? Yeah.
I was just going to add, when you look at the commentary that we have around potential mitigations, and it sort of talks for greater flexibility in supply, and I think that sort of encompasses the opportunity to shift some of that surplus to future years.
Yep, indeed. Anything further to add there, Alex, or was that are you happy with the answers to the question? Is there any further questions or clarifications that you'd like to seek?
Hey, Greg, I've asked a couple of questions in the chat. I'll ask it.
Okay.
The first question is, how is AEMO factoring in the domestic gas already being purchased by the Waitsia JV and exported via Karratha Gas Plant?
Right, that one, that's reasonably straightforward. So it's effectively netted out in our forecasts. So yeah, is that clear enough answer to the question? In the first, yeah, sorry.
How is that? Because it's domestic gas being produced. How is
it's an offset?
So you just ignore it. Effectively, you say it's being delivered into a pipeline, and then we took it out of the pipeline.
Exactly correct. Yeah, that's exactly what we do in this situation.
Why? So how is Karratha Gas Plant not registered as a large user then?
That one, I think I would need to defer or pass on to one of our team members to address that query. My understanding, so this is maybe just an outside sort of comment is we are monitoring that situation, and the Waitsia plant will be delivering into the Dampier-Bunbury pipeline, and so it will be registered on the GBB, and there are some metering. There is metering available to be able to see what is happening, but the overall total picture is actually less clear, and that's why we've used an offsetting assumption over the period until 29.
I think it's straightforward, isn't it? And if you're a user of gas and you're using more than 10 TJs a day, you're required to register as a large user, and indeed everybody else is registered as a large user. It's a bit unusual why Karratha Gas Plant isn't registered as a large user.
Right.
Yeah, I think that issue is probably one to have a chat to one of our other teams, so we can come back to you if you like on that one, Michael.
Yeah, sure. And so then why is AEMO taking a different view on the West Coast to the East Coast? On the East Coast, gas produced and entering the domestic market would show as supply, and it would show as demand when it enters the LNG export facility. But in WA, we've chosen to do an offset and effectively you can't see how much gas is being produced or supplied or demand for LNG exports that are coming from the domestic market. Is there a reason why WA needs to be different?
Yeah, good question. So I think maybe could we take that one offline and get back to you with a response on that, because that requires a good answer for you.
Yeah, thanks, Greg.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question.
Yeah,
Greg, can that response go to everybody?
Yeah, I think we can deliver that in the yes.
Well, yeah. Can we prioritise that particular question, because I believe it's come up in a previous forum as well. So we'll prioritise the answer to that question.
Yeah, it has been asked for many months and there's been a total failure of response. So yeah, would appreciate some feedback.
Sure, thank you. So let's see, Pierce, Scott Ashton has asked a question. GSOO data book figure 48 is weights of forecast startup reflecting current status. 100 to 2025 looks too high unless the chart is fiscal calendar. Well, it's a calendar year chart. Okay, can all charts please state calendar year or fiscal year to avoid confusion? So it's definitely a calendar year. So yeah, so we can take that on and make that clarification in the next round. Okay, I see a raised hand. Is that Pierce? Pierce, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and asking your question.
It's basically a follow-up from those previous ones regarding the Waitsia JV, and the question is, if the gas that's being purchased out of the domestic market currently for export is netted out, can you tell us what volumes are being purchased and exported, even if they're not being shown on the bulletin board?
Right, that's a difficult, confidential, commercial confidential question. Yeah, I think the short answer is we can't do that unless anybody in the team is able to provide an additional response to that.
It's not the point of the whole GIFT project. It's about transparency in the market. They are the underlying principles when the project was implemented 15 years ago. This is smoke and mirrors, you know, big boys playing secret games. It's not acceptable.
Right.
I'd love to see why it's confidential, because our gas demand is just as confidential as the amount of gas being exported as LNG. In fact, it's, you know, we've got alumina competitors here, and it's valuable knowledge to understand how much gas your competitor is using. I'm struggling to see what the reason is.
We will engage with Department of Jobs, Tourism, Science and Innovation and have a chat to them as well as others to get to the bottom of that and make sure that we include that in our response to stakeholders. We certainly understand the importance of transparency in this space, so we'll come back to you on that point.
Okay, thank you, Katie. So do we have any further questions here? Okay, I don't see any further questions. So potentially, if there are no further questions, could I hand back over to Katie to close out the session?
Thanks very much, Greg. And thanks all for tuning in for today's stakeholder session. I know that it's sort of wrapping up the end of the year, and it's a busy time for many, so we appreciate you taking the time to tune in. Thanks for the great questions. As mentioned, we will work through those questions in particular in relation to Waitsia and come back to you in a reasonable period of time. I hope you have a fantastic end to the year, and for those taking holidays, I hope you have a wonderful time. Enjoy yourselves. Stay safe. Thank you.
Merry Christmas, everybody.